Today we're going to be painting this lovely Eider Duck in the middle of a fairly simple background, so we get some landscape practice in there as well. The photograph for this comes from the lovely Rosie Dutton Photography. I will leave her details in the description box below if you want to check out some more of her work. I'll also list the equipment and the colours used in the description box below, but this is what we will be using today. I tried to keep this simple with the colours, so I'm using French Ultramarine, Cadmium Red, Quinacridone Rose and New Gamboge. You could probably just do this with 3 primaries, so you don't necessarily have to have 2 different types of red, but I like the pink tone of the Quinacridone Rose. It made a really nice purple when mixed with the French Ultramarine. The brushes that I'm using are my number 12 round, the number 6 round and the number 3 rigger. I used a little bit of masking fluid for the duck, and I also used some white gouache for some highlights at the end. So I have a bit of a makeshift palette at the moment. I put the paint around the edge of this plate and then I mix everything in the centre so it all swirls together nicely. I'm going to try and show you how I do that for the beginning of this, so you'll be able to see the colour mixing at the same time as the painting. When I do the painting of the duck, I do zoom in a little bit so you can't see the colour mixing for that, but you should be able to see it at the start. I've started with a simple line drawing without too much detail, particularly in the background. I want to keep that as simple and straightforward as possible. I'm also painting this on a small scale, which I have done for previous landscape watercolours that I've attempted. I like the small scale, particularly while I'm practicing. It allows me to practice different watercolour techniques without working on a huge painting. And the idea will eventually be to upscale this a little bit and be able to paint watercolour landscapes of all sizes. I wanted one of the main focuses of this painting to be on practicing using a nice continuous wash in the background, so I decided to add masking fluid to the duck just to make that a little bit easier. It meant I didn't have to slow down to work around the details of the duck, which was particularly useful on such a small scale, and I could focus primarily on getting the wash right in the background. I left this to dry completely before beginning the wash, and I planned out what colours I was going to use before I started painting, just to make the process a bit easier. So here is the palette, or the plate. The French Ultramarine is on the right hand side of the image, so if I reach over there, that's the colour that I'm going for. The rest of the colours should hopefully be in view, so you'll be able to get a bit of an idea of how I mixed these things up to be able to create the background. I'm using my round 12 brush for this to be able to add a continuous wash to the background. I'm adding some clean water there, and then I'm mixing French Ultramarine with some Quinacridone Rose. I use New Gamboge just to tone it down when it's looking slightly more purple, but you can see here that it is just a case of trial and error really. I am mixing colours of varying proportions. Sometimes I go a bit overboard. There you can see that Quinacridone Rose really made it very purple. So the rest of the process is just adding tiny bits of other colours in there. More New Gamboge, more New French Ultramarine? Regular French Ultramarine, just to get it to the tone that I want for the background. And there's an awful lot of water in there as well, because I wanted this to be a really light wash in the background. I didn't want it to overpower anything. The main focus is going to be on the land in the front of the bird. I tried to separate that colour out once I was happy with it, and I made a slightly different tone on the top of the plate. So more New Gamboge and Quinacridone Rose in there, so it's a little bit more of a brown tone. The idea with the background here is to create a nice soft sky all the way down to where the rocks begin, and then have that darker colour blending into it, so it gives the impression of some hazy rocks in the distance. And then the foreground rocks will have a hard edge, and they will hopefully stand out from the rest of the painting. I tilted the page a little bit to encourage the paint to run down, and I kept it a nice consistency, so there was always a bead of water at the bottom which I could encourage to flow down. The idea with this was just to not get any backruns or any streakiness, which is something that I've struggled with in previous paintings, so I was pretty pleased with how this one ended up turning out. I added the darker layer as I got closer to the bottom and just blended that in together nicely. I used clean water to encourage that colour to blend down further into the page and to diffuse it a little bit. That way when I add the next layer of colour for those rocks at the bottom, it will sit over the top and there'll only be one hard edge rather than several hard edges where that line would have dried otherwise. I wanted to darken the rocks in the background, so I'm adding some more Quinacridone Rose and new Gamboge in with my blue colour just to create a dark purpley brown. I'm using my number 6 round brush for this, so I don't add too much water to the mixture. I wanted this to be a thicker consistency so it would sit on top of the paint I've already put down without creating too many back runs, which I didn't want. I wanted a nice smooth finish on the back. And then I blended it out along the top edge to stop it looking too spidery and just give that impression of some nice hazy distant rocks. So you want to leave the background to dry completely before you move on to the foreground rocks. Once that was done, I decided to mix up 3 main colours that would be the basis of the rocks in the foreground. I wanted a purpley brown shadow tone, an orange tone and a blue shadow tone. So that's what you'll see being mixed up here. For the shadow tone, I think I used all 4 colours, whereas New Gamboge is the primary colour for the orange tone and French Ultramarine is the main colour in the blue. I wanted these colours to be a similar consistency so they'd all sit nicely together and blend well together without one overpowering the other, and it was useful to have them all ready to go so that I was just able to place the colours down wherever I wanted to without having to stop and mix up new colours every single time I wanted to change. You want to make sure that these are wet enough that they are able to blend together without drying too quickly, and you also want to work fairly quickly with this, adding colours side by side so that it doesn't create any streaks or any backruns or cauliflowers. You'll see that occasionally I'll add a little bit of another colour into that mix just to change it up a little bit and add more interest to the background. And you should also notice that those colours have swirled together, so we're getting really interesting mixes here instead of the same colour every single time. Once the first layer was applied, it was time to add some extra colours on top of that. Anytime you add extra colours on top of something you've just painted, you want to make sure it's a thicker consistency so that it sits on top nicely and it doesn't get lost in that mix that you've already put down before, or it doesn't create any unusual watermarks that you're not actually going for. This extra layer was also a good opportunity to darken areas. As your watercolour dries, it will lighten, so this just allowed me to get the shadow tones in that I wanted. Depending on how dry the background is, you will get different effects when you add paint, so this was a really nice time just to practice with that and see what kind of marks I could make with the paint depending on how long I left it before I added the next layer. Each time I'm just making sure it's a bit thicker than the last and refining it as I go. The really dark shadows here are French Ultramarine and some of the red mixed with a tiny little bit of yellow so that it's not completely purple, but I'm trying to make all of these colours just by using my 3 main primaries. I'm also using my brush to lift out some highlights at this point as well while the paint is still wet. I added some new Gamboge Red to my shadow tones to create a dark reddy orange, and then used that to create some splatter effects along the front. I'm using a paper towel just to block the rest of the painting. I was really happy with how it looked and I didn't want some accidental paint splats over there. This is a really thick mix of blue and red with a tiny bit of new Gamboge for some of the really dark shadows. At this point the paint in the background was almost dry, but it still was a little damp, so the edges did blend out and it wasn't too harsh sitting on top of the previous colour. And as it dries, I'm adding some more of that orangey brown colour for some extra detail in the foreground. The idea is that these are seaweed coloured rocks. Seaweed covered rocks, either one of those will do. So I'm attempting to get a bit of texture in there as well and really put quite a lot of that orangey colour on. I'm adding some more texture and some more shadow tones to the rocks now, and this was really just a case of having a look at what the watercolour had done and responding to that rather than having a preset plan to follow strictly, and just adding extra detail where I felt like it was necessary. I added some really dark shadows once the background was pretty much completely dry, and for this I used my French Ultramarine, the Cadmium Red and a tiny bit of yellow. The main thing really is just to make it a really thick mixture so it sits on top of the others easily and it stands out. I'm adding some pure new Gamboge here for some really bright orange areas, and you can see that the rocks are starting to take shape now. Occasionally when you add a lot of detail, it can sometimes make the painting seem a bit disjointed. So to try and draw everything together again, I've decided to add a glaze over the top of this. I'm adding a lot of water to the plate. I did clean this beforehand, but obviously not very well, and so it's picking up some of the colour that was down there before. I added a little bit of new Gamboge into this leftover colour and then applied that over all of the rocks just to bring everything together. You want to make sure that the paint underneath is completely dry before you do this, so you don't risk ruining what you've already put down. And you want to make sure that the glaze is really light, it's a light wash, so that you don't overpower everything as well. This is a good opportunity to redefine some of your highlights, so I'm using my number 6 round brush to lift out some highlighted details and a little bit of paper towel to dab out there as well. If it's too wet, this might dab too much of the paint off, so do be careful when you do this so you don't lift up too much. But as for the glaze itself, I really feel like it helped to tie everything in together, and it all looks much more smooth and much more blended now than it did before, so I'm really happy with the result of that glaze. I'm just working at the back edge there just to try and soften it a little bit. Although I do like the idea of a hard edge for the foreground rocks, the line across the back was a little bit unnatural, so I'm just trying to blend that out a little bit. Once the background is completely dry, it's a good opportunity to remove the masking fluid, and then we can work on the lovely Eider Duck. This bit was quite tricky. If you remove it too quickly, sometimes you can tear the paper underneath, so I tried to be really careful with this. It still lifted some of the paper on the underneath. I'm not sure if I perhaps added too thick of a layer of this, but it wasn't too bad, and it preserved the shape of the duck, which is what the intention was. So here we have the close-up of the duck. Unfortunately, I can't show the whole palette for this close-up, but I will try and attempt to show you what colours I'm using as I go along, or explain them. I'm beginning with 2 tones, a purple and an orange. I'll show you the consistency of those now, but they're quite light, so we'll be able to build on top of that. The purple tone is made with Quinacridone Rose and French Ultramarine, and the orange is a mix of new Gamboge and Quinacridone Rose. And I'm just going to alternate between the 2 of those to provide a base for this duck, and then we'll be able to build up some of the other colours on top of that. Like we did with the background, you can alternate the shades of these colours a little as you go, so there's a little bit more blue in that area there, and it just adds more interest to what would otherwise be a solid colour. I'm adding more new Gamboge into my orange mix for a brighter streak across the back of the head. And then a touch of French Ultramarine gives a nice green tone that can sit next to it. That same orangey green is going to be used on the beak. I'm keeping things simple for the moment. I will build up a little bit more detail as I go, but because this is on such a small scale, I'm not going to include as much detail as I would if I was painting this larger. The same orangey green tone can be used on the legs as an initial layer, and then I'm going to use that purple shadow tone with a little bit more red and blue to create some shadows in the wings and the tail feathers, which eventually are going to have a much darker consistency of paint on top. I'm using blue and red with a touch of new Gamboge for the really dark black feathers that we're going to apply. The key to this is making the mixture really nice and thick so it appears super dark, and it sits on top of those other colours quite nicely. The darker areas are really helping to define the structure of the duck, and it's also giving me a good idea of which shadow areas need to be a little bit darker when I come round to adding detail later. Once I've left the initial wash to dry a little, I'm using my rigger brush now to add in some detail. I've got a green tone for the edge of the beak there, which is French Ultramarine and new Gamboge, and the rigger brush just means I'm not adding too much water there because I don't want to dilute it in such a small space. I'm also redefining some of the really dark areas with that blue and red and tiny bit of new Gamboge mixed in. It's an even thicker mixture than before, so it looks even darker on top of the dark feathers we already added. I'm working around all of the duck now by adding darker details where I think they're needed. Here I'm adding some French Ultramarine and new Gamboge for a darker green, just to frame the face there for the marking on the back of the neck of the eider duck, and then I'm going to go over some shadow details further around the bird. This is a good place to define the shape of the duck, but you want to make sure you don't add too much detail, particularly if you're painting on such a small scale, because it's very easy to overdo this and make it look a bit too overcrowded. I'm using a darker version of the blue and red mixed together for a nice dark purple there, and that's just going to define the edge of the wing and create a little bit more shape out of the forms that we painted before. You'll see I'm adding an orangey brown colour here, so I'm using all the same colours that we had before, but I'm making a darker version of them each time, so this is just a thicker layer of that new Gamboge and some red. I'm painting in some shadows over the legs, which is the blue and the red and more new Gamboge this time, so it's more on the brown side. And then I'm putting a couple of those details in the ground around the feet just to attach the duck to the background so it doesn't look like it's floating above it. I'm redefining some of the darkest areas of the Eider Duck with my French Ultramarine and my red and a tiny bit of new Gamboge with a really thick black mixture here. You might not need to do this. If your paint was thick enough the first time around, it might be dark enough, but I just want to redefine some of those shadow tones and make them really stand out. I'm going to add a bit more detail around the feet of the duck so that the most detailed part of the background will be centred around our focal point there, which is our lovely Eider Duck. And then I'm going to go over the duck with some white gouache to make those highlights really stand out. The white gouache was really helpful here rather than leaving the paper white underneath. It was useful because of the small scale. Sometimes the colours in the background do run a little bit, so this was really great just to put in those highlights back over top of that. I'm redefining a couple of shadows along the edge of the duck there just to separate it from the background a little bit because the shadow tone was quite similar to the sky. And getting towards the end of the painting now, I'm just blending some of the edges around the duck where the masking fluid covered some parts of the sky. And that just about brings us to the end of this painting. I did actually make a further change after I removed the masking tape from this. I went over with another glaze over those rocks just to tie in some of the detail that I added at the end. It was really similar to what we did before, so I made sure that the painting was completely dry beforehand, and then I made a really simple glaze like we did the first time with mostly water and just a touch of those other colours mixed in there. And I put that all over the background again just to tie everything in together. So when you see the finished painting here, that's what you're seeing. Once again, I want to thank you all for watching. Thanks so much for your support. I upload a new video every Wednesday, so I'll see you all again next week.